He had everything: money, power, a mansion by the ocean, and a family that pretended to love him. But when a soaking wet girl knocked on his door one stormy night, holding a secret he was never meant to know, his perfect world began to fall apart. What she revealed would expose decades of lies, betrayal, and a love story buried alive. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss new stories, and enjoy watching. Richard Ellison had a big old house sitting high up on a hill outside Charleston, the kind of place folks slow their cars down to look at. All white columns and fancy glass windows that shine like mirrors when the sun hit just right. You could see the ocean from the porch, and at night the wind from the water made the palm trees sway like they were gossiping. It looked like a dream from the outside, but inside it was cold as a church on Monday morning. Richard was rich, richer than most could imagine, but money didn't make him happy, not anymore. His wife had passed a few years back, and after that the light went out of him. He didn't laugh much, didn't talk much. He filled that house with family, brothers, sisters, their spouses, kids running around, and thought maybe it would make things feel alive again. But it didn't. They were all just there for what he had, waiting like vultures for the day they could pick over what was left. Every morning he'd come downstairs, and there'd be smiling faces, all sugary sweet. His sister would ask if he slept well, his brother would talk about some great new business idea, and the nieces and nephews would hang around like flies near honey. He knew what they were doing, every last one of them. They wanted to stay close so they wouldn't be forgotten in that will of his. They thought they were clever, but Richard saw through them clear as day. Still, he said nothing. He just let them talk, nodding now and then, pretending not to notice how they whispered when he left the room. He'd go to his study and stare out at the sea, watching the waves crash on the rocks. That was his peace, the only thing that didn't ask anything from him. He worked a bit, moved some money here and there, kept his business going because it gave him something to do. When dinner came around, everyone gathered at that long table. They laughed too loud, ate too much, and told fake stories about how close they all were as a family. Richard would sit at the head, quiet, letting them fill the air with noise. He barely touched his food. Most nights he'd just excuse himself early and walk upstairs to his room. It was too big for one man, and every piece of furniture reminded him of his wife. The smell of her perfume still lingered faintly in the closet, like a ghost that refused to leave. Sometimes late at night, when the whole house finally went quiet, he'd take a walk outside. The air smelled like salt and rain. He'd listen to the ocean and think about the days when life had meant something. Back then, he'd worked hard, thinking if he earned enough, he could buy safety, comfort, maybe even love. But now, standing there in the dark, he understood he'd bought himself a prison instead. He thought about how funny people were. When he had nothing, everyone had time for him. When he got rich, everyone wanted something from him. There was no middle ground. He'd given his family jobs, bought them houses, helped with their debts, but it never filled the hole in his chest. No one came to ask how he was doing. They only came to make sure he was still breathing and still worth inheriting from. The housekeeper, an old woman who'd worked for him before his wife died, was probably the only one who cared in her own quiet way. She'd bring him tea before bed, say he looked tired, tell him to rest. He'd nod and thank her, but deep down he knew even she pitied him. Everyone did. When he went to bed, he'd lie there staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind rattle the shutters. He'd think about what it would feel like to just leave it all behind. Sell the house, disappear, live somewhere small and simple. But he never did. Maybe he was too old for that kind of freedom. Maybe he was just scared. To everyone else, Richard Ellison had it all: money, power, property. But inside that mansion full of polished silver and empty hearts, he was just another lonely old man waiting for the world to forget him. The only thing that truly belonged to him anymore was the sound of the waves and the memories of the woman who used to love him before all the money came. Everything else in that house was borrowed, bought, or pretending. That night the rain came down like the sky was falling apart. The wind was howling, trees were bending, and thunder was rolling so loud it made the windows shake. The whole house was lit up from lightning flashes, but inside no one bothered to move. The family was sitting around pretending to watch TV, pretending not to hear the knocking that came through all that noise. Nobody wanted to get wet or deal with strangers in a storm. So when the knocking came again, steady but weak, Richard got up himself. He went to the big front door, the one hardly anyone ever used, and there she was, a young girl standing in the pouring rain, shaking like a leaf. Her hair was soaked, her dress stuck to her skin, and her shoes looked like they'd seen better days. She was holding an envelope in both hands like it was something important. Her eyes looked tired but serious, like she'd been walking for miles and wouldn't leave until someone listened. Richard could have just shut the door. Lord knows everyone else in that house would have done exactly that. But something in her face stopped him. There was something strong about her, even though she looked like she might collapse right there on the porch. So he stepped aside and let her in. The smell of rain and mud followed her into the hall, and the fancy rug got dirty in seconds. The girl said her name was Lee. She wasn't loud, but her voice carried this quiet kind of power. She said she didn't come for money, she came for the truth. Her mama had known Richard a long time ago, back when he was still in school. They'd gone their separate ways and he'd never heard from her again. Now her mama was sick, real sick, and before things got worse, she told Lee who her daddy was. That's why the girl had come to meet him, not to beg, not to make trouble, just to know. Richard didn't know what to think. He stood there, still wet from the open door, trying to make sense of it all. The way she spoke, steady but nervous, reminded him of someone, though he couldn't place it right away. Maybe it was her eyes or the way she held herself. She looked like someone who had been through hard times but refused to give up. He took her coat and told her to warm up by the fire. The others stayed back, peeking around corners like chickens in the yard. He could feel their stares even without looking. They were already whispering, already planning what to say later. None of them liked it when someone new showed up, especially not someone who might have a claim to his name or his money. Lee sat by the fireplace, still clutching that envelope, her clothes steaming from the heat. She was quiet, just looking around, probably seeing right through the fake smiles and polished silver. The whole place had that stiff air, like a church full of people pretending to be holy. She must have felt it too, because her shoulders stayed tight, ready to run if she had to. Richard watched her for a while, and something in his chest shifted. It had been years since he'd seen anyone look at him like that, not with greed, not with pity, but with something honest. Maybe hope, maybe fear, maybe both. By the time she finished her tea, the storm had started to ease up outside. But inside that house, another storm was brewing. The relatives were already talking in low voices, wondering who she really was and what she wanted. Some said she was lying. Others said she'd come to ruin them all. Richard didn't say a word to them. He just told the girl she could stay the night. That one small choice changed everything. From that moment on, the air in the house felt different. The walls seemed to hold their breath. And somewhere deep inside, every greedy heart under that roof began to feel the first sting of fear, because someone had just walked in who saw things as they really were. By morning, the whole house was buzzing like a nest of hornets. The storm had passed, but now there was another kind of thunder rolling inside those walls. Richard's sisters were huddled up in the kitchen whispering, their coffee going cold. The nephews were on their phones, probably talking to lawyers or checking who could dig up dirt. His brother stomped around red-faced, mumbling about how some random girl was trying to steal what was family business. Everyone acted polite when Richard walked in, but the moment his back was turned, the knives came out. Lee came downstairs looking shy but calm, wearing one of the housekeeper's clean shirts. At the breakfast table, all those fake smiles were waiting for her. They poured her juice, asked her questions, told her how nice it was that she came such a long way. But their eyes were sharp, mean, measuring her every move. She didn't say much, just thanked them softly and tried to eat, though the food probably tasted like dust under all that pressure. Richard sat across from her, watching the scene unfold. He could feel the lies bouncing off the walls like echoes. He'd lived long enough to know when people were pretending, and his family were professionals at it. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't care what they thought. He was too focused on the girl. She talked about her life, about working late shifts at a diner, taking care of her sick mama, saving up for nursing school. There wasn't a single word about money or inheritance, and that made Richard listen even harder. After breakfast, the relatives started their little meetings. They called it a family discussion, but it was nothing more than plotting. The sisters decided the girl had to be lying, that she was after the will. The nephews went online trying to dig up anything about her or her mother. Someone even called a private investigator, hoping to prove she'd made it all up. They were so busy scheming that they didn't even hide it well. Lee wasn't stupid. She could tell the difference between polite and poisonous. Every time she walked into a room, the talking stopped. Every time she left, it started again. One of the younger nephews laughed too loud and said she looked too confident for someone with no proof. The housekeeper told him to hush, but Lee heard it. She said nothing, just kept her head high, though her stomach was tight with worry. That night, while most of the lights were off, Lee woke up thirsty and went down the hall for some water. She stopped when she heard voices behind a half-closed door. It was Richard's brother and two of the nephews. They were talking low, but the words cut clear enough through the dark. They were saying things about her, about how she needed to be taken care of before she ruined everything. One of them said she should be sent away quietly, and the others laughed, though it wasn't the kind of laugh that meant jokes. Lee stood there frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't move until they stopped talking. When she finally made it back to her room, she sat on the edge of the bed shaking. She'd known they didn't like her, but now she understood it wasn't dislike. It was hate mixed with fear. They saw her as a threat. She realized this house wasn't just cold and greedy, it was dangerous. Behind all those nice clothes and dinner smiles, these people were capable of anything. She looked out the window, where the sky was finally clear again. Somewhere out there was a world that made sense, where people worked hard and told the truth. But in this big fancy house, she was surrounded by snakes pretending to be family. Lee knew she couldn't trust anyone but herself now. She didn't know yet how deep their lies went, but she could feel it. Something ugly was coming. And no matter what, she'd have to stay sharp, because walking into that house had been like stepping into a trap. Early in the morning, when the house was still quiet and the smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen, Lee wandered into the old library. She hadn't meant to snoop around, but something about that room felt different, like it had been waiting for her. The shelves were covered in dust, the kind of dust that meant nobody had cared for years. She brushed her hand along one of the lower shelves and noticed a loose wooden panel. When she pulled it back, a small box slipped out and hit the floor with a dull sound. It was an old wooden box, the kind used to keep letters or little keepsakes. The latch was rusted, but it opened easy. Inside were a bunch of envelopes tied together with a faded ribbon, the paper yellowed and fragile. Lee sat down on the floor right there and untied the ribbon carefully. The handwriting was her mother's. Every line felt like a whisper from the past. Her mother wrote about a man she loved deeply, a man who had promised her the moon but had gone off chasing money and dreams instead. She wrote about how she found out she was pregnant, how she tried to tell him, how she sent letters, one after another, but no answer ever came. She waited, hoping he'd remember her, but he never did. Lee's hands shook as she read them all. The pain in those words was real, but something else stood out. The letters had never been opened. Every envelope was still sealed. Not torn, not read, just hidden. Someone had put them in that box and tucked them away. Someone didn't want them to be found. Lee stared at the pile, realizing what it meant. He had never seen them. He hadn't ignored her mother. He just hadn't known. A chill went down her spine. Who would have done something like that? Who could have taken those letters before they reached him? Someone who lived close enough, someone who knew what a child like her might mean for the family money. She took the box and went straight to Richard's office. He was there, like always, surrounded by his paperwork, the kind of man who thought he'd already seen every secret life could throw at him. When she placed the letters on his desk, he looked confused at first. But then he saw the handwriting, and everything inside him seemed to stop. He picked one up, turned it over in his hands, and carefully broke the seal. As he read, his face went pale. The more he read, the heavier he looked. When he got to the part about the baby, about her, his eyes filled with something Lee had never seen in him before. It wasn't anger. It was shock, then grief, then guilt, all tangled together. He leaned back in his chair, silent, holding the letters like they were made of glass. He whispered something to himself that Lee couldn't hear, but it was clear now. He had known nothing. Not about the child, not about her mother's pain, not about the love that had been buried under years of lies. Someone had stolen that truth from him. Lee could almost see his mind working, going over the faces of everyone in that house. The brother who handled his mail, the sister who managed his calendar, the nephew who worked in his company. Which one of them had made sure those letters never reached him? Which one had decided to hide the truth to keep their share of his fortune safe? Richard looked at Lee then, and she saw tears in his eyes. For the first time, he looked like a man who understood how badly his life had been twisted by greed, not just his own, but everyone else's. He realized he had been robbed not only of a daughter, but of years of love he never got to know. Lee didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The truth was right there in those unopened envelopes, in the faded ink and the trembling of his hands. He finally knew the real story, and he finally understood that the people he trusted the most might have been the ones who betrayed him first. By the next morning, the whole house felt different. The air was thick, like before a storm. Richard didn't come down for breakfast, and that alone was enough to make the relatives nervous. They kept glancing toward the stairs, whispering, wondering what he and that girl were doing shut up in his office all night. No one knew about the letters yet, but they could sense something had changed. Lee barely slept. She stayed up thinking about what she'd found, about those unopened envelopes and the way Richard's face had gone gray when he read them. She knew he wasn't angry at her. He was angry at whoever had kept the truth from him all those years. Someone under that very roof had stolen more than mail. They'd stolen a whole piece of his life. Around noon, Richard finally called everyone to the main hall. His voice was steady, but it had that quiet tone that made people stop talking real quick. The whole bunch gathered: his brother, two sisters, their grown kids, all trying to look innocent. They were dressed up, pretending it was some sort of business talk, but everyone was sweating. Richard stood there with the box of letters in his hand. He said he had found something that had been hidden from him, something that proved he'd been lied to for years. He didn't shout, didn't wave his arms, just spoke calm, which somehow made it scarier. Then he asked one simple question: who handled his personal mail 20 years ago? Nobody spoke, not at first. Then one of the sisters looked pale and started stammering about how back then things got misplaced. The brother's face turned red and he barked something about not digging up old nonsense. But Richard didn't blink. He knew. It was his brother, the one who had managed his office in those days, the one always protecting him from distractions, the one who had the most to gain by keeping an heir out of the picture. Lee watched it all from the corner, feeling her stomach twist. This wasn't just a fight about money anymore. It was the truth cutting through years of lies. The brother tried to deny it, saying it was all a misunderstanding, that maybe the letters had never come at all. But Richard laid the box on the table and said the postmarks didn't lie. Each one was from the same town, the same year, addressed straight to him, and never opened. The room went silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Finally, Richard said that from now on, things would be different. He was done living surrounded by people who only saw him as a bank account. He said he wanted peace in his own house again, and if that meant being alone with the people who actually cared about him, then so be it. That was the moment the family started to unravel. The sisters started crying, the nephews argued, everyone pointed fingers at each other. Richard didn't stay to listen. He turned and left the room, leaving them to their own noise. Later that evening, he sat on the porch with Lee. The sky was pink and quiet after all the shouting. He told her she didn't have to stay if she didn't want to, that he wouldn't blame her for walking away from this mess. But Lee shook her head softly. She wasn't there for money, and he knew that now. She was there for her mother, and maybe for him too, even if she didn't say it out loud. Inside the house, suitcases were being packed. The brother was gone before sunrise. The sisters followed not long after, pretending they left out of pride, not guilt. But everyone knew what really drove them out: shame and fear of what Richard would do next. When the last car left the driveway, the mansion finally went quiet. Not empty, quiet. For the first time in years, it felt like the house could breathe again. Lee helped the old housekeeper clean up after the chaos. They opened the windows, let the fresh air in, and threw out the half-eaten breakfast that nobody had touched. That night, Richard sat alone in his study, reading one of the letters again. He traced the handwriting with his finger and thought about the life he could have had, the one that was stolen from him. But when he looked out the window and saw Lee walking through the garden, he realized something. It wasn't too late to start over. The lies were gone, the house was still standing, and for once, he wasn't completely alone. Maybe fate had waited all these years just to bring that girl to his door, not to punish him, but to save what was left of his heart. A few weeks later, the house on the hill didn't look or sound the same anymore. The heavy silence that used to hang over every room was gone. The air smelled like coffee, bread, and salt from the sea. Lee's laughter mixed with the sound of the waves, and Richard found himself listening to it the way people listen to music they don't want to end. He had gone to find Lee's mother himself. It took some digging, but he found her living quietly in a small town a few hours away. She looked tired, thinner than he remembered, her face marked by years of struggle and sickness. When she opened the door, she froze like she was staring at a ghost. He didn't try to charm her or explain too much. He just told her the truth. He'd never seen her letters, never known about the child, and that someone had stolen that truth from both of them. She listened, arms crossed, silent. Then she nodded and let him in. They talked for hours, not like strangers, but like two people who had carried the same wound in different ways. Somewhere between the quiet and the tears, something old and familiar sparked again. The years had changed them, but the feeling hadn't died. It had just gone quiet, waiting for the right time to return. When Richard brought her back to the house, Lee was overjoyed. The woman who had once seemed frail and fading began to glow again. With proper care, good doctors, and the peace she hadn't known in decades, her health started to improve. Richard spared no expense, but it wasn't just medicine that healed her, it was love. The kind that had been lost, then found again. He made sure she had warm days on the porch, soft blankets when the evenings got cool, and laughter filling every room. As the weeks passed, their bond deepened. Richard realized he hadn't just found forgiveness. He'd found the woman who had been his first and only real love. And she, after years of pain and disappointment, let herself believe that maybe it wasn't too late for happiness. They'd both wasted enough years living in regret. Now they wanted to live. They started taking slow walks together in the garden at sunset. Sometimes they didn't talk at all, just walked side by side, their hands brushing, hearts quietly remembering how to love. Lee would watch them from the porch, smiling, knowing that somehow fate had brought them all back to where they were supposed to be. By summer, her mother's health had turned around completely. The doctors said she was stronger than anyone expected. Richard liked to joke that she just needed a reason to fight, and that reason was sitting beside her every morning, pouring her coffee, holding her hand. One evening, when the sun dipped low over the ocean and the sky turned gold, Richard asked her to stay forever. No grand speeches, no fancy dinner, just a simple promise on the porch where it all began again. She said yes, tears in her eyes but a smile that made her look years younger. They didn't need anything else. Lee helped them plan a small ceremony under the tree they had planted, the one they called their second chance tree. The housekeeper cried, the wind carried the smell of salt and flowers, and for the first time in decades, that house was full of joy that didn't depend on money. Afterward, when they sat watching the ocean, Richard held his wife's hand and looked at Lee standing by the tree, and he whispered that this, not the fortune, not the name, was what he should have built his life around all along. The house on the hill wasn't haunted anymore. It was alive, filled with laughter, warmth, and the kind of love that comes only after years of storms. Richard and the woman he'd lost once got their second chance, not just at love, but at life. And when the evening light fell through the open windows, Lee smiled, knowing the family she'd dreamed of her whole life was finally real. I hope you enjoyed this story. I'd love to hear what you think. Tell me in the comments what touched you most, what surprised you, or what made you stop and think. Your feedback means a lot and helps me make every story even better. Thanks for being here and sharing this moment with me. Come back tomorrow. I've got many more heartfelt and thought-provoking stories waiting for you.